adder for non-community adder projects webinar. My name is Max Joel. I'm the director of the New York Sun Initiative at NYSERDA, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Sarah Jayanthi and Dylan Cunningham, as well as our events team who are helping host this webinar. I see some people are still trickling into the webinar, but we can go ahead and get started with the next slide, please. So before we get into some of the details about the ICSA tier, I will just offer a little bit of housekeeping. This webinar will be recorded and the deck will be posted online. So I'll repeat that a couple times throughout, but we will be posting all of this. And we will be having a Q&A session at the end. Once we reach that point, that's when NYSERDA staff can address questions, but at any time during the presentation, you can use the chat or Q&A function in WebEx to put questions in. Please put them in, as they occur to you. We'll sort them out, and if we answer your question as we move through the presentation, great. If not, we'll try to address it at the end. So getting started here, I believe most of the people on this webinar probably saw the email notification about the new tier. We can now confirm that it will be open for applications on May 7th. It will go live in the application portal at that time. I'll emphasize that there's no rush. We anticipate there being plenty of capacity remaining in the Upstate ICSA tranche. So that is simply when it will be available as an option. Again, just to really emphasize, applications should be complete when they come in. So please take the time to assemble a full application that meets all the requirements before submitting. Please don't rush to submit on May 7th if that would result in an incomplete application. So just to set this in context for anyone who is new to the Inclusive Community Solar Adder, this is really a add-on to the current program. It's not anything significantly new. Just as there are currently different incentive tiers for upstate projects, for downstate projects, there's different incentive tiers for projects that receive the community credit. There's a tier for projects that received the community adder. There is now a tier for projects that received neither the community credit or community adder as the Upstate community adder ran out several months ago. So this new tier is a new incentive level and structure, but it continues to draw from the currently open 860 megawatt Upstate ICSA tranche. And while, of course, the community adder is no longer available, the general community adder, that is, any project currently submitting to New York Sun continues to be eligible for the base megawatt block incentive, the prevailing wage adder, as well as the brownfield adder and any other items for which it may be eligible, in addition to, if the qualifications are met, the new ICSA tier. So the major difference with the new ICSA tier is this two-component structure. The second one, the performance incentive, I'll just start there because that is the status quo. Again, as most of the people on this webinar are probably at least somewhat familiar with the current ICSA structure. 10 cents a watt for upstate projects is paid out based on the actual capacity dedicated to eligible ICSA eligible subscribers. So that is not changing at all. What is being added is this fixed incentive that applies to the full project capacity that will be set at 7 cents a watt. So again, that will apply to the full project capacity as long as the minimum ICSA requirements are met. So I'm sure many of you are looking at those numbers and saying, well, geez, this looks just like the community adder structure, only now it's a part of the ICSA. Well, you are right. That is very much the structure here. the actual incentive payment for, say, 2 identical projects, one that received the community adder and then applied for the ICSA versus one that did not receive the community adder and subsequently applied for this new tier of the ICSA. Those incentive payments would be identical, provided that in both examples they are meeting the requirements of the ICSA. So we'll get into some of those examples further on in the presentation. One difference that will come into play here, however, is the timing of both the application and the payment of that fixed incentive. Unlike the community adder, where the community adder is awarded to the project at the same time as the base megawatt block incentive, plus things like the prevailing wage adder, and then is also paid as part of the sort of regular New York Sun incentive invoice. The new fixed component of the ICSA will be running as part of the ICSA. So it would be awarded to a project at the same time as the rest of the ICSA, which typically comes after the megawatt block award. And it would also be paid out at the same time as the first invoice for the ICSA, which tends to come later than the megawatt block invoice. So next slide, please. So just to illustrate this this structure, shown them side by side. Again, what's clear here is that the stacks are the same. The 10 cents a watt for that ICSA eligible capacity and the 7 cent a watt across the total project capacity, but really underscoring again that if minimum ICSA requirements are met. So those requirements at a high level are that 40% of the capacity of the project be dedicated to ICSA eligible subscribers, and that half of that, or no less than 20%, be dedicated to eligible residential subscribers. If those requirements are not met, neither part of the ICSA, the 7 cents or the 10 cents, will be paid to a project. Next slide, please. So this is just showing the same thing one other way. Some folks like to see it in the graphics. Some people just like to see numbers on the page. And in this table, DAC, or disadvantaged communities, is being used as something of a stand-in for ICSA eligibility. They're not completely synonymous, so just refer to the program rules on that, but sort of shorthand here. But anyway, so we see in this first column really the most significant difference in the amount paid out between a project that received the community adder and later applied for the ICSA. If a project like that with CDG was built, but at the end of the day was not able to meet the ICSA requirements, it would still receive the full community adder as well as the megawatt block incentive, anything else that they had been eligible for, and would not have, but would not have received any ICSA. However, under the new tier, if just to emphasize this again, if the minimum ICSA requirements are not met, no part of this is paid out to the project. The project could still get its base megawatt block incentive, but would not receive any of this higher value. Now, in the two examples to the farther right, and we'll have some more details around this later, if 40% of the capacity is dedicated to ICSA eligible subscribers, or 100%, the incentive payment is the same, and it scales in between there. Again, to note a key difference is also the timing of the payment. So the full fixed component, that 7 cents, sort of the equivalent to the community adder, is paid out in full at the first ICSA incentive payment, but it again is at that first ICSA incentive payment. So once the host allocation sheet and other required ICSA documents are submitted and reviewed by NYSERDA, the minimum requirements are confirmed as having been met. At that point, that full fixed incentive, the full 7 cents across the entire capacity, plus whatever of the performance incentive is payable at that time, will be paid out. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to walk through a couple of funding examples. I've tried to just hit home the point that the dollar amounts largely look the same as with community adder, but now it's part of the ICSA, and it's just really the difference again is that distinction that the minimum ICSA requirements have to be met and the timing of the award and the payment. But these examples will just help drive that home a little. Next slide, please. So this just goes into some of that detail, breaks down the formula as people who've been working with the ICSA are aware. The ICSA award letter will include an award size based on the 60% of the capacity of the project, so that 10% performance payment applied to the 60%. Going forward, projects under this new tier will have the full fixed incentive included in that award amount as well. And then the performance payments are based on actual performance, including if more than 60% of the project is ultimately subscribed to eligible subscribers. No part of that is changing with the introduction of this new tier. Next slide, please. So just to give a pretty vanilla example, say about 55% of the project winds up being subscribed to ICSA eligible subscribers. In this example, more than 20% are residential subscribers, and more than half of the ICSA portion is residential. So this project meets all the requirements. It's a pretty typical ICSA project. We see a lot of the projects that are being completed kind of meet this general profile. So next slide, please. So we can see here how the payment calculations would work out if this were part of the new tier. So first and perhaps foremost, this new fixed component, the 7 cents a watt multiplied by the full, in this example to have nice round numbers, 5 megawatt DC project. That full incentive amount is all part of that first payment. Again, that's the same dollar amount this project would have for the community adder if it had been eligible at that point in time. That fixed component is added to the performance component. So again, this is getting a little into the weeds with the payment calculations, but we wanted to show this all on the page, and there's similar information in the program manual on the website. Again, this part of it is no change at all from the program as it stands now. But the total project capacity is multiplied by the percentage that is dedicated to ICSA eligible subscribers. That is multiplied by the 10 cents a watt. And for the first payment, it is half of that total. That gives you a first payment that is proportionally quite large compared to the second and third payments. Again, that's because of the inclusion of that fixed component in the full amount. The second and third payments would be calculated in exactly the same way as they are being calculated for projects that currently have the ICSA and received it with the community adder in place. It's their performance that they're able to demonstrate at that time period, again, using 55% here, times 10 cents a watt, times 25% of the total award. Next slide, please. Okay, so here's an example where greater than 60% of the project capacity meets the ICSA requirements. So this is a high performing project, and we are also seeing a number of these projects getting 60, 70, 80, 90% ICSA, which is really terrific to see in the program. Next slide, please. So the calculation methodology for the actual payment is the same. This slide just reiterates, again, this is no change from the current system, that if a project is greater than 60%, we do adjust up their total funding level. pending funding availability. That's just the way the program has been structured. We track this. There is a dashboard on the website that shows how much of this high performance funding is available. Right now, we have plenty, and we've budgeted quite generously to encourage projects to attempt to achieve this higher performance. But there is technically a limitation on this funds, and in the event they are exhausted, the performance component would be limited to 60%. So next slide, please. Um, so this is showing how this kind of plays out with the new tier. You'll see below it's really sort of the same calculation, just with an updated award amount if greater than 60% is achieved. So the number goes up. That, of course, doesn't, of course, has no impact on the fixed component, because that's always been across the entire capacity. It just impacts the performance component. Again, this is really no change from the current program design, other than the addition of this fixed component. Next slide, please. And then just finally, here's that illustrated in a chart showing all the calculations. And once that adjustment has been made, the calculation works just the same. It uses 70% in this example instead of 55% in the previous for the performance component. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide, and I definitely understand we're running through these somewhat complex scenarios quite quickly. I am moving quickly because a lot of this content is similar to what was presented on previous webinars and doesn't really represent a change from the current ICSA program rules. What I'm really trying to show here is the sort of pieces of these examples that relate to the new ICSA tier and the fixed component, which ultimately hopefully is coming across as relatively straightforward, though we'll certainly see what questions you all have. So the final example I have today is the unhappy one, where the minimum ICSA requirements are not met, a project is completed, and for whatever reason, the customer acquisition did not successfully achieve the minimum 40% ICSA subscribers, with at least 20% of those being residential subscribers. This project is unfortunately not eligible to receive an ICSA payment. That's the case under the current program structure. However, with the new ICSA tier, much more money is at risk. That full fixed component, that 7 cents a watt across the entire capacity of the project, would not be payable to this project if the minimum requirements are not met. Now you can see in our program manual the full process for calculating whether the minimum requirements have been met. I'll note that in updates made to the program manual last month, we changed some of the timing rules so that now the project owner can submit one of the first, I believe it's 3 allocations to demonstrate eligibility instead of just the first, to give owners a little more flexibility, especially as some utilities have been lagging on the allocation process. But regardless, in this scenario where ICSA requirements are not met, no part of the ICSA can be paid out. Next slide, please. So now I'll turn to the Q&A. I'm going to be going on mute. We'll review the questions that have come in. Again, thank you for joining the webinar. And again, I know that was a really quick walkthrough of especially some of the numbers. Hopefully folks were able to follow that or can review the deck once it's posted. And we'll also, I'm sure, get a chance to walk through some things again in the Q&A. Okay, we're getting some great questions in. The first question is, are projects reaching approved status anytime after October 12th, 2023, eligible to apply for the new tier? And that October 12th, 2023, I believe is just a reference to when round 2 of the ICSA opened. I'm pretty sure the answer is yes. It would be, you know, in all likelihood, projects that were approved much more recently after the community adder was exhausted. That would be, actually, that I'm sorry. I misspoke. I'm pretty sure the answer is yes, but if you want to reach out with sort of a specific project scenario, please do so. There is a question here about an earlier set of projects that were in kind of a in megawatt block 17. We are aware of this question and are just kind of going through all the details. So we'll follow up on this, whether a block 17 project would be eligible for the new ICSA tier. Apologies for not having a question on the spot on that. There's a question about the total budget, which is a good one. Is it safe to assume that both components will be available for the full tranche that's now posted, the full 860 megawatts? The answer is yes. That's all kind of part of the ICSA budget. Yeah. The question is the 7 cent. Well, the question is the 7 cent community adder subject to recapture in future years? So just in the interest of maximum clarity, I think that question is asking about the new fixed component of the ICSA and not the older community adder. But just to answer completely, the older community adder is subject to recapture if a project converts from CDG to to not CDG. That's sort of a long-standing and separate rule. The ICSA as a whole is subject to recapture. We will take another look at this, but I believe the answer is yes, that both components of this new ICSA tier would be subject to prorated recapture per the the existing ICSA rules. Those rules were not changed. There's a question about exactly how that would look. We will try to provide some more clarity on that, either in the program manual itself or through an FAQ. I appreciate some of the questions here that are noting that process might need to be a little bit different. So we'll look at that. Yeah, a lot of questions about kind of clawback, non-compliance, and whether that will play out differently between the two components. So we'll certainly look into that. Are projects that are currently operating eligible? No, unless there's sort of a narrow carve out when round 2 opened for operational projects, but I doubt that any project currently meets that. But please, the person who put in this question can reach out about an individual project. I'm going to go, a lot more coming in. Thank you so much for all the excellent questions. I'm going to go on mute for just a minute to look at a few more of these. Okay, I'll start by restating from the top of this presentation will be available on the website. It usually takes us a few days to post. Um, I'll answer a couple more questions about the new tier, and then there were some general ICSA questions that I'll turn over to my colleague Sarah Jayanthi. Um, the actually, Sarah, if you don't mind, let me turn it over to you now. It looks like most of these questions are about that, those recapture questions, which again, I appreciate the kind of detailed questions being provided on that topic.
Yeah, Max, I think you're looking at starting at question 6.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah. So I think one of the questions that we had come in is what happens if a project is eligible and then receives the fixed payment, then becomes non-compliant after the fact. So I think, as Max was alluding to, the clawback provisions, or the recapture provisions that are currently in ICSA round 2 would still apply. So the project is required to have the project filled with ICSA eligible subscribers for, I forget the specific amount of time, but that's in the program rules. And NYSERDA, as part of its compliance process, will do random audits of projects where we will reach out to projects, ask what their current subscriber percentages are. If their subscriber percentages match what they had originally invoiced for, then we're all set. And in fact, we do have an error rate. So if they're within the error rate, we won't have any kind of required adjustment. But if the project isn't compliant after the fact, the project will be required to adjust after the fact. They will be given a certain amount of time to fill the project with eligible customers. And if they're not compliant around that, then they could be subject to penalties that are outlined in the program rules. So I recommend looking at that section of the program rules where we talk about the importance of maintaining the ICSA eligible subscriber makeup throughout kind of the timeline that we've set up in the program rules. I think, Max, I think question 7 you did answer, right? Because that was about somebody that's currently operating. Somebody had a question about ICSA application reviews. So as it states in the program rules, the reviews take 60 days if there are no incomplete or missing information. So I think this is where Max was very clear at the very beginning that, once this new tier launches, don't feel the need to rush. We definitely saw in the launch of round 2 a rush of applications where not all of the information was complete or consistent. There were a lot of questions that we had, and so it did delay review time because we have to go back and forth with the review teams. So just if your application has no missing or incomplete information, or information we were not entered kind of correctly, if we would have whole sections of the M&I plan just not filled out, it should only take 60 days. But of course, if there are issues, that will extend the timeline. Is the dashboard reflecting the most recent updates? If whoever asked that question, provide kind of more clarity on what they're asking. If they're asking if the tier information has been added, all information around the new tier will be added after that new tier launches. So after May 7th, that is something that we've been working on, making sure that information will be on there following the release of the new tier on May 7th. So for question number 10, somebody had a question about if they have 50% of the ICSA eligible subscribers, do we get paid for 50% or the 40%, since that's the minimum tier that we're in? So to answer this question, if you have a project where 50% of your project capacity is filled with ICSA eligible subscribers, and also the requirement of the percentage of that capacity is half of the customers on that capacity are residential, right? So the residential component is really important. You are then paid out on the actual percent of the project that is ICSA. So in this scenario, if 50% of your project is ICSA eligible subscribers, you're getting paid for that 50%. if your project is 75% eligible subscribers and you're meeting the residential like capacity requirement, then 75% of the project will get paid out. So it's really based on whatever that actual allocation is, not necessarily based on what your max award is. Let's see. Max, I'm gonna have you maybe answer question 11. I'll move on to question 12, which is questions about the payments. How do the payments work? So the payments work for the ICSA. And Dylan, do you want to just go to the funding example slide where we talk about the payments? There's the table for it. Or not Dylan, I'm sorry, Sal. So sorry. I forgot who was manning the slides. So if you go back to kind of the first example that we show for this. Yep, so it's actually the next slide, Sal. Great. So how the payments work is the payments happen at, PTO, and then a year following PTO is the second payment, and then the third payment is 2 years following PTO. For the first PTO payment, this is one where we did adjust this based on kind of feedback that we've gotten from the development community that when they're submitting their subscriber list, they're not necessarily the final set of subscribers aren't necessarily the ones that are happening at PTO. It usually happens one or two allocation lists after. So we're giving projects an option that it can be the allocation list at PTO, or I think it can be the next one like 1 month later or 2 months later. Please read the program rules. So depending on which allocation list you do for PTO, it would be your second year payment would be kind of 12 months after that. And then your third payment, which would be your second year, would be 24 months after that PTO payment. So I hope I didn't confuse anybody with the way that I described that, but it is laid out in the program rules. I highly recommend reading that. All right, let me go back to the Q&A. All right, and I'm going to go on mute while I look through some stuff. I don't know, Max, if you're ready to answer some things.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I can take on a couple that you flagged. There were, I think these are more general questions about, the ICSA, as well as there's references to car charging and battery storage and stormwater management. But there's a general question as whether minority-owned developers are eligible for additional incentives. The answer right now is no. I appreciate the question, and definitely encourage you to investigate all these different programs for solar as well as EV charging and battery storage. I think so I see a follow-up question related to projects that have submitted an ICSA application in October 2023 but did not receive the community adder. So I think the question is whether there needs to be a reapplication or whether we can automatically add them to the new tier. That's a good question. Let me talk to our the team that works on our Salesforce portal. Hopefully we can communicate with you and do that automatically, so you don't have to do like a resubmittal or anything. But
If you have, oh, Max, I was just going to jump in. If you do have specific applications where you think they fall under that scenario, just email us directly with those application numbers so that when we follow up with our Salesforce team, as you said, we have examples to look at here.
Yeah, and just thinking out loud, I think no matter what, we may be able to make the change in our portal and regenerate an application for you to sign, but you'd still have to sign the new application because it would be a different dollar amount. But to Sarah's point, please follow up directly.
Okay, there's a question about what percent of the projects, or kind of the current tier, the dashboard only shows a 5% adoption. Is this accurate? Whoever sent this, the dashboard is only able to show the percentage of primary applications. So for anybody who, to jog everyone's memory how the ICSA works, project teams will send one application that describes what the strategy will be to fill that project, and also kind of any other projects that are part of their portfolio. And so once NYSERDA approves that primary application, the project team is then allowed to submit subsequent applications and, certify that those subsequent applications are going to follow basically what NYSERDA has already approved in the primary application. So we aren't able to show, just because of the way the technology is structured with our application, we weren't able to kind of have subsequent applications queued up. So what we have asked providers is to list what they plan on submitting as subsequent applications as an attachment to their primary application. So I've been keeping kind of track of how that's going, and how many projects are kind of planning on applying for the ICSA, both primary and subsequent. And so I can say verbally right now that, based on the primary and subsequent applications that were coming in, we're still very much underneath that 860 megawatt um, uh, uh, project block maximum. What we're looking at here is, between 150 and 200 megawatts. That includes both the primary and the subsequent. That's how many have currently are kind of in the queue for applying for the ICSA. So I hope that provides people a little bit more clarity on kind of how many projects are currently applying for the ICSA. As I said, we're still like very much in a good place in terms of not hitting that 860 megawatts for the Upstate tier. So please continue to apply. Don't worry about the block running out. So yeah, we're at between 150 and 200 megawatts of projects, which are both primary and subsequent together. Okay. Are there any concerns? And I think this other one, are there any other concerns around the availability of the total eligible customers in the market? As more projects are installed, it will become increasingly challenging to acquire eligible customers and remain compliant. NYSERDA has run some numbers on number of eligible customers across different territories. I believe we actually have published it in certain presentations in the past. So when we were announcing the expanded Solar for All program, we actually did publish some numbers around the number of low to moderate income customers, at least in National Grid territory. So I think we're not concerned. I will say that we've kind of been looking at the number of income eligible customers across the state, and those numbers are still kind of in a comfortable place for projects to be able to fill with customers. Max, I don't know if you wanted to add to that, or if that was
No, nothing to add. That's we're still I think relatively early in serving this very very large market. So there's a lot of need and a lot of opportunity.
Someone had a question about what is PTO. Oh, Dylan already answered it. For anybody who doesn't know, it's commercial operation. When is permission to operate for the project? Oh, the 150 to 200 megawatts, that is, somebody was asking if that's specifically for Upstate ICSA primary and secondary apps, or does it include Con Ed? That does include Con Ed, but Con Ed is a very small portion of it. So I don't have it broken out between Con Ed and Upstate, but Con Ed is a very small portion. So you can really think of that as the Upstate numbers.
Okay, I give it just one more minute to see if there's any additional questions that have come in. And certainly if you do have other questions, please reach out via the program email. All right then. Well, thank you everyone for joining this afternoon. I'll say again, this will be posted online. Um, and as we referenced at the beginning, the new application here will go live on Thursday, and at the same time, there'll be more information online. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon.